Cruel world. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. If you're a true crime fan, you've probably seen the documentary on Netflix called American Nightmare, released recently. One central theme is the catalogue of mistakes made by the cops. So this particular video that you're watching right now is outlining those mistakes, not just listing them, which anyone can do, but using my experience as a criminal psychiatrist to explain the psychological processes behind the numerous mistakes, and kind of separately but connected, the psychology behind victim blaming in general, but specifically in SA cases. When I say SA, I'm using that phrase that rhymes with schmexual assault. I don't want to say it because YouTube will punish me, but that's what I'll be referring to it as now, SA cases. So I'm just going to play you a little bit to whet your appetite of the trailer. Here we go.
Emergency.
My girlfriend's niece got kidnapped last night.
And you didn't call last night when this occurred?
I wish I'd have.
Tell me what happened. I wake up. Bright light blinding us. Taser goes off. And I see they're wearing wetsuits.
So, you can probably get a little taste of what's going on from that trailer. We both know that your worst nightmare is having to recite a poem to your class in front of the teacher that you fancied in year 6, only to realise that you followed through on a fart. But your second worst nightmare is being kidnapped, SA'd, the police not only not believing you, but then trying to frame you or trying to make it look as if the whole thing was a hoax and it was your fault. So first of all, I'm going to give you a summary of the whole documentary, particularly focusing on the mistakes made by the police, and later I will analyse them from a psychological perspective. Spoiler alert, I'm obviously going to tell you a bit about what happens in the documentary. I can't do a psychological analysis of the mistakes without mentioning the mistakes. I'm good, but I'm not that good. Okay, a little bit more of the trailer, and then we'll get right into it after that. Here we go.
What did they swim in? So what happens next?
I asked Denise to tie my hands behind my back.
Did she discover something?
Found text messages.
She mad? Oh, she's cheating. There's blood in your house.
Blood in your house. Okay, so quick summary of what happened. So it's 2015 in Vallejo in Northern California. Our victims stroke potential perpetrators in this case are Aaron Quinn and Denise Huskins. Some men reportedly broke into the house, kidnapped Denise. Aaron calls the cops the next morning, and right from the beginning, the documentary kind of suggests that Aaron looks suspicious because there's odd elements to his story. So, for example, he says that he was drugged with what he thinks is diazepam or Nitol, and that's the explanation for the delay. So there's unexpected bits, there's bizarre, there's things that are unfeasible. So, for example, he says that the perpetrators said that they were actually there to try and kidnap his ex-girlfriend, Andrea. He says that the perpetrators were wearing swimsuits, which, hang on, wait, is it swimsuits? No, it's not swimsuits, wetsuits. Swimsuits would be too bizarre. And then he says part of the reason he didn't phone the police earlier was because he was still sedated with these medications, but also he has this weird story about how they've put a red square of tape and they've put a camera in the corner, and the kidnappers said, if we see that you're calling the police, we're watching you through this camera, then we're going to kill Denise, etc., etc. So it is elaborate and it is far-fetched. In fact, if you look at the documentary, the police actually say to him that it's too elaborate, it's too far-fetched, and that's why he turns into a suspect. And the police basically don't believe a word that Aaron is saying right from the beginning, which is one of the main problems in this entire investigation, and we will come back to that. I'll just quickly say off the bat, I think you could argue that Aaron's story is a bit too weird, a bit too audacious to be false. It's too kind of specific. So in other words, if Aaron is lying to hide his tracks, if, say, he killed Denise in a flash of anger, then you would have thought that somebody who's relatively intelligent would make up something that's feasible. And just as a sidestep, I cannot emphasize enough, my Psych for Sore guys and gals, that you need to lawyer up if you're ever in this situation, because despite what they might try and suggest, despite what you might think, the police's first priority is not your well-being. They are trained to try and find suspects. So you could be completely innocent, but you might still appear suspicious. So for example, you might be very distressed, you might be unsure about details, you might contradict yourself, and the police might assume that you're lying. Personally, I think I would be terrible at lying, partially because I've got such a bad memory. To be honest, I can't even lie to my 6-year-old son. No, Nibbles is dead. He's dead forever. There's no such thing as hamster heaven. And even if there was, he'd be going to hamster hell. He's a very, very bad rodent. So we see that Aaron takes this lie detector test and the FBI agent tells him that he's failed. Now, I've done a whole other video on lie detector tests. I'll put the links in the description. Always be plugging. But basically, I'll summarize it. Lie detector tests are not reliable because they do not detect lies. I'll say it again. They do not detect lies. All they do is they detect fear and discomfort. You like blood pressure, pupil size, etc., etc. So in a case exactly like this, where you have somebody who's giving evidence, who's being questioned, if they're extremely worried, like Aaron was, he was worried about the safety of Denise, he didn't even know she was alive, then it looks like he is agitated and therefore could be presumed guilty, versus another set of circumstances where you could be interviewing the actual murderer, but he could be cold-hearted. He could have no obvious signs of fear to detect. He could be like a psychopath. Anyway, so there's many twists in this story and in this documentary, but basically the police think that Aaron has killed Denise. And then suddenly what happens is another twist, is a crime reporter gets sent this audio clip from Denise. It's a voice recording, and it has to have been recorded that day as opposed to Aaron recording it in advance, because it mentions a news story that happened that day, this plane crash in the Alps. So what do the police do? They try and dig up dirt on Denise when this happens. So they ask her parents about her previous relationships and lovers. There's no urgency to find her is one of the things that comes out. And in fact, they carry on questioning Aaron instead of going out and looking for Denise and looking for the perpetrator. And they ask him about cracks in their relationships and issues they've had. You know, he's still kind of in touch and has feelings for his ex-girlfriend, Andrea. So basically, I think the police are strongly suggesting at this point that maybe Denise has faked being kidnapped as revenge. And in fact, when another egregious mistake that the police mistake is that I watched too much Cluedo, Detective Mustard from the Vallejo Police Department talks to Denise's mother and says to her that some women who have been abused as a child try and reenact this thrill. So they find out that Denise was SA'd at a very young age, around 12. So he's trying to suggest that she's kind of fabricating this situation to reenact this. Clearly, Colonel Mustard needs to be signed up for some insensitivity training. Okay, then a further twist in this documentary. A couple of days later, Denise actually comes home. So she's dropped off at her family home, which is about 400 miles from where she was kidnapped, all in California. And that doesn't make sense to anybody, to us, to the police. Because why would the kidnapper drop her off home? You know, it's like a door-to-door kidnapping service. So they call it an elaborate hoax. And she's publicly demonized, vilified in a press conference by the police. And then in the documentary, we hear about the ordeal from Denise's perspective. She tells us what happened to her in the last couple of days. She was tied up, she was blindfolded. An interesting aspect to me, as a bit of an aside, is the way that the kidnapper treated her. So he almost showed her this false kindness, this false empathy. For example, trying to advise her to pretend to be asleep when his associates arrive because they're not as nice as her and they might try and hurt her. He tries to make jokes with her at points. He tells her a bit about his background, that he's in the military, that he's got PTSD. Remember that bit because it's relevant to something else I'm going to tell you. He even tries to explain the reason that he SAs her. So he says that he needs to make a video of them having sex so that he can release it to the public if she goes to the police. And, you know, he does this twice. He SAs her twice. And to me, it feels like he's kind of grooming her and he's gaslighting her. I'm not going to go into what gaslighting is now, but I've done another video on it on my channel. I'll leave the link in the description. Always be plugging. Anyway, so Denise is released. She makes minimal contact with the police, which I admit does look a bit odd. You could say it even looks a bit guilty. There's strange elements to her kind of explanation and to her story. So first of all, she said that she wasn't SA'd. Then she changes her mind and says that she was. So again, the police think that this all is indication that she's fabricating everything. But the documentary explains why she did that. So she she lied initially about being SA'd because her family were threatened, because she was threatened, because the perpetrator said that he would release this video, and she's already dealt with this horrific ordeal, and then she's like, worried about this video going viral and the amount of attention it would get, because by now it's like a national case, so logically she knows that this video is released, people are going to see it because the public, they love what is salubrious, salacious, and she doesn't want this released when she's being assaulted in such a vulnerable position. So then Denise gets her own attorney, which for the UK listeners is American speak for lawyer, and the police basically say that the fault is all her, and a Valero agent called Kenny Park actually says in a police press conference that Denise has wasted valuable resources from our community. Basically, he's not saying directly that she's guilty, but he's strongly insinuating it. So the media pick up on this and they start calling it a hoax. And there's all these like national headlines saying that Denise has made it up. And these are not like saying maybe it's a hoax. Is it a hoax? They're actually calling her a liar. The headline is that this is all a hoax. And then in the documentary, we have footage of her interrogation by the police. And Denise's line of questioning from the police is basically suggesting that she's lying. They're asking her questions like, have you ever been in the trunk of this car before? Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you scream? And, this is victim blaming. There's no two ways about it. They say there's lots of inconsistencies in her story, which there are, which I've explained. And the FBI agent says to her that it's a federal crime for you to be lying to her. And then even more audaciously, the FBI agent says to Denise's lawyer, have you seen Gone Girl? Because there was a film that was released, Ben Affleck, the year before, where this woman goes missing and then she appears. And it's kind of, so it's almost like the police officer is suggesting to the lawyer that Denise is copying this movie. And the lawyer says, well, why would you think like that? You're supposed to be a professional. How can you be influenced by a movie? And in the documentary, Denise's lawyer uses two phrases that I think are very interesting: confirmation bias and tunnel vision. They're very relevant. I will come back to those phrases. I'll explain what they are, what the differences are later on in this video. Okay, I've been babbling on long enough. I'm itching to talk about some psychological processes. So these are the mental processes behind what we've just seen, what I've just described, which is victim blaming in SA cases. So I'm going to go through them all, then I'm going to tell you how it's relevant to this case. Before I do that, I'm just going to play you a tiny bit more of the trailer.
Do you know where she is?
I didn't do anything. Yeah, you did.
Oh my God, it's her.
I just got a message. She's walking over to my house.
Never heard of a case where the kidnappers dropped their victim at the front door of their house.
Yeah, so as I said, that's one of the weird elements of the story and part of the reason that the police don't believe what Denise is saying. Okay, so what are the psychological processes behind victim blaming? Number one is a just world hypothesis. So many people hold this subconscious belief in a just world where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So this leads to this like erroneous attribution of blame towards the victim in a negative situation. So basically saying if something bad has happened, then she must be for some way to be blamed for it. Number two psychological process in victim blaming is fundamental attribution error. So that's similar to the first thing, but slightly different. So this bias focuses on attributing someone's actions to internal factors like personality, like choices, rather than external factors like the perpetrator's sexual desires. So in the context of SA, this leads to blaming the victim's clothing, behavior. Maybe the victim is intoxicated at the time of the assault, and it downplays the perpetrator's responsibility. And as I'm sure you can tell when I'm saying this is rooted in misogyny and being generally judgmental. So remember that time in 2017 when your Uncle Roger came home for Christmas and he got drunk on special brew, and there was this news story about a girl who was SA'd, and then he said she was probably asking for it dressed up like a hussy. That is fundamental attribution error, and that is why you've not seen your Uncle Roger since Christmas. Number three reason of victim blaming in assault cases is traditional gender roles. So there's deep-seated societal expectations surrounding gender roles, and that plays a significant role. So women specifically are often stereotyped as being like passive and vulnerable, whilst men are seen as dominant and sexually assertive. So this can lead to victim blaming when a woman is assaulted, as her behaviour might be considered provocative, whilst the man's actions are excused unfairly as being natural male urges. So let's face it, I'm talking about psychological processes, but this is basically sexism and misogyny. So it doesn't matter what you call it. As a great philosopher once said, you can put a cat in an oven and that don't make it a biscuit. Number 4 reason why there's psychological explanations for blaming the victim is cognitive dissonance. You might have heard this phrase before. So that's facing the reality of sexual assault can be emotionally distressing. We have to accept that the world is a dangerous place. So victim blaming is a way of reducing that dissonance by placing the blame on the victim. So you're maintaining your false worldview that there is safety and there's control in the world. So it has to be her fault. It can't happen to me. Connected to that, but slightly different, is a fear of vulnerability. That's the 5th reason why people might blame the victim. So acknowledging the presence of an SA can provoke fear and anxiety in one's own vulnerability. So therefore blaming the victim can create this like false sense of security by implying that only such things happen to these types of people. Thus you distancing yourself from that risk. Number 6 reason why people can blame the victim is simply a lack of empathy. So some individuals might struggle to understand the emotional trauma associated with SA, and they might lack the necessary empathy to kind of comprehend the experience from the victim's points of view. And I actually think this is probably the most relevant in terms of this specific situation, the police perspective with Denise. I suppose you could argue that police officers have been hardened by years in the force and seeing all these violence and all this crime. But also you could equally argue that the police force attracts people who have a natural lack of compassion and they just want to, rough up criminals. So we're talking about the age-old question: which came first, the chicken or the egg's stream insensitivity? And the 7th reason why somebody might blame the victim in an SA case is the social pressure and groupthink. So you probably heard that phrase before, groupthink. Existing social norms and group dynamics can influence individuals to adopt victim-blaming attitudes. So for example, it might be a fear of disapproval or ostracization from peer or social groups can lead to individuals to conform to prevailing narratives. So what I'm talking about is peer pressure or culture that pervades within the police force. I think that some of what I've talked about is relevant, particularly the attitudes of individual police officers and the culture in the Vallejo department. But I would also say that even though the last couple are relevant in this case, it's a slightly different scenario because the police officers not only are blaming Denise for potentially being SA'd, but I think they actually don't believe what she's saying in the first place. And I think that's because she doesn't fit into a typical presentation of what they would expect an SA victim to look like. So she's not outwardly agitated. She's changed her story several times. She seems to want to distance herself from the police rather than talk about and tell them about the experience. So that's not what they're used to thinking, is it? So it's a very sort of simplistic view of the world. They have this archetypes of what a villain should be like, of what a victim should be like, what a criminal should be like. It's all about goodies and baddies, black and white, cowboys and Indians. So Denise, is not a typical victim. So in their mind, she must be a perpetrator. So rumours then start spreading about police. Things are released in the press, as I said before. And so far in this video, I've been blaming the police, rightfully so. But I also think the media need to take some of that responsibility. And there's an impact on Denise. She gets these horrific messages, for example, on Facebook, not only calling her a liar, but there's some messages, as you saw in the documentary, saying that she deserves to die. Jesus, that's a bit much. I have been nothing like the amount of trauma Denise has been through, but I've certainly been the target of some hate on the internet. If you're interested, you should check out the comments I got on my High Ren video. So I reviewed that song. If you want to see me getting slagged off on the internet, go to the YouTube comments. If you're interested in that, first of all, how rude. Secondly, you should check out my other video, which is response to Sick Boy, music video by Ren, where I respond to the Ren fans. Always be plugging. Okay, so carrying on, there's another strange twist, another surreal coincidence, which is the FBI agent overlooking this case called Sesma. Actually, there's a conflict of interest because the couple find out that he used to date Andrea, the ex-girlfriend of Aaron, and Aaron, Denise, and Andrea all work together. So this is a conflict, obviously. This is raised to the police department, to the government by Aaron and Denise, and it's pretty much ignored. And then Denise is talking about how she was assaulted, not only at the age of 12, but also at the age of 19. And the police officers at that time tried to talk her out of it. They basically said, it's your word versus his. It's not going to go anywhere. And she says something along the lines of, what needs to happen to me or to any woman to be believed by the police? And I can't say it any better than that. It's a very poignant, it's a very accurate line, which again, to me, indicates a huge culture of misogyny in some police forces. Okay, I want to step back and go back to the psychological processes behind everything that's going on. Before that, I'm just going to do a bit more of the trailer.
We thought she's this innocent victim. She looks more like a suspect.
Police now wondering, is Huskins a real-life Gone Girl?
Something else has happened here. Maybe this is about revenge.
We find zip ties, toy guns, and a blow-up doll.
Can this get any stranger?
Who's really behind all of this?
Okay, so then the documentary moves on and tells us about the perpetrator, about the guy who eventually gets caught. His name is Matthew Muller. And there's a connection to previous offences. So he is, we strongly suspect, even though he's never been charged with it, the Mare Island creeper. So Mare Island's another place in California. Around 2014, this man was looking into the windows of students and taking photos. And I think this is escalated, perverse and sexualized behaviour. Some students followed him and realised who he was and realised that he lived in Mare Island. They basically got his identity. They found out he was ex-military. They found out he was a lawyer. But the police dropped the case, which is just mind-blowing. Just as a quick aside, some aspects of exactly what I've been talking about remind me, they have harrowing echoes of the case of Wayne Couzens. So as you probably know, Wayne Couzens is the ex-Metropolitan Police Officer. He snatched 33-year-old Sarah Everett in London on March the 3rd, 2021. He essayed her, he ended up killing her. Absolutely abominable, horrific case. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that Wayne Couzens had lots of previous concerning incidents. So for example, he exposed himself to a female cyclist in a country lane in Kent in November 2020, just months before he kidnapped, essayed and murdered Sarah. And there's lots of overlap between that case and Muller in that there's misogyny in the police force. Both police forces ignored previous sexual perversions, which eventually escalated the perpetrator's behaviour. In Wayne Couzens' case, who's a police officer, it felt like the police were just protecting their own or not taking it seriously. We have to ask the question, why did the police drop the case of the Mare Island creep? Was it laziness? Was it incompetence? Whatever the reason was, it's obvious, if they had intervened at that point, his behaviour wouldn't have escalated, and what happened to Denise and other people would not have happened. Okay, so moving on, the documentary then focuses on the hero, the one unrotten apple in the 5-0, and the hero of the story, who may or may not have a name that sounds a bit like a stripper. She's called Misty Cruz, and she's from the Dublin Police Department, not the Dubliners, but Dublin in California. She finds there's a second kidnapping. She investigates it. She finds some evidence in that the perpetrator leaves his phone behind, Muller, and that's how they find out who it is. Obviously, I'm glad that it happened because it meant that he got caught. But let's face it, I mean, that was a pretty lucky break. It wasn't like the police's hard work. They just got a bit lucky. I mean, if I saw that in a film, like you, I'd probably be like, come on, that's lazy writing. The perpetrator's never going to leave his phone behind. But that's what happened. So they traced him to his house in Lake Tahoe. They arrested him. This police officer, Misty Cruz, she finds this blacked out pair of swimming goggles, which he used on the second kidnapped victim, which matches the story of what Denise and Aaron said. She finds this strand of blonde hair actually attached to the goggles, and she wants to know who that victim was. Not knowing at that time it's Denise. She finds out about Denise's case, which occurred a few months earlier. She's heard about this famous Gone Girl case, and so she pieces it together. And then this is the shocking bit. Even when she realizes what's happened, she tries to reach out to the Vallejo Police Department, and they dismiss her. She can't make the call. She can't get through to anybody in the first place. And when she eventually does, she gets through to the FBI. She speaks to David Sesma, the guy that's in charge. And it takes a lot for her to convince him that the cases are connected. And to me, that's just shocking, isn't it? Because That's an actual police officer trying to convince another police officer or FBI agent that there's a connection, that this is a real case. So that's a police officer. That's the struggle, the uphill struggle that she faced. Imagine if you were the traumatized victim going up against it. This kind of not believing in victims or not getting their sides reminds me of another case that I was involved in. I went on TV, on a daytime TV show, talking with my friend Isla Traquois, who herself was a victim of stalking, and she talked about how the police didn't basically believe her and tried to take the side of the stalker. I made a video on it, and I've also included 5 top tips of how to deal with being stalked. Always be plugging. I'll leave the links in the description. Okay, so moving on, the perpetrator is called Matthew Muller. We know that he has post-traumatic stress disorder. We know he's got bipolar affective disorder. He gets found guilty. Thank God he gets a 40-year prison sentence. As a very quick aside, I'm going to very quickly talk about, does his psychiatric diagnosis, does it actually matter? Is it relevant? So another way of asking that question is, could Muller have potentially gotten away with it if he could prove that he had these psychiatric disorders? The reason I want to talk about this is because it's very much in line with my professional job. So I work as an expert witness. I literally give evidence in criminal cases about psychiatric offences. So basically, the long and short of it is, in theory, it's possible for somebody like Muller to get away with it if he was mentally unwell and not in control of his actions. He'd be assessed by a forensic psychiatrist such as myself for the defence or for the prosecution, but they would have to prove that his mental illness was so intense and he was so kind of controlled by his victims, hearing voices, that he either didn't know what he was doing or he didn't know that it was wrong. So he's so sexually disinhibited that he, carried out a kidnapping and an essay without actually being able to control his behaviour. Thankfully, not relevant in this case. Clearly, Muller knew what he was doing because he, tried to cover his tracks. He blindfolded his victims. He made this video, threatened to release it. So he knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was doing is wrong. Because otherwise, why would you put in the effort to try and disguise yourself? His actions were very much purposeful and very much goal-driven. Okay, I'm going to play the rest of this trailer, and then we're going to move on to my explanation of why the police made the mistakes they made.
They get an email confessing to the crime. Did we all get this wrong?
Okay, so I told you before that police made loads of mistakes. Let's think about some of the psychological processes. As I said before, I think some elements of Aaron's story were a bit far-fetched, weren't they? I think they were unfeasible, but being unfeasible is not the same as being impossible. If a woman disappears, it's very often the partner's. Kidnappings are very rarely random. So I think it's fair that the police should have Aaron as a suspect. But, and this is the crucial bit, I think there's some elements of the story that presumably could have easily been backed up. So, for example, he claimed that he was given diazepam or Nitol. I've worked in a prison as a psychiatrist, and it's very simple to detect diazepam in somebody's bloodstream. You just do a very simple urine test. It literally takes 5 minutes. And also, what he said was very specific, and it seems like the police did almost no crime scene investigation. So the perpetrator left a camera in the corner. They left some tape, which is why Aaron couldn't move in the first place. They could have looked into the camera. They could have traced where the camera was purchased. The perpetrator stole Aaron and Denise's car. They could have looked at CCTV footage to at least see if a car had been driven away, because if they think that Aaron carried out the killing and was trying to get rid of the body, then surely just by following the car, that at least would have put him in the timescales of whether he was at home when he said he was at home, whether he was driving the car or not. So really some basic things could have been sorted out. They might not have been able to solve the entire investigation by looking at these things, but they could at least made a decision about whether they believed Aaron or not, rather than just going through their gut instinct. Okay, I said before that there was a voice message from Denise saying that she's missing, so now they know that she's not dead. And I mentioned before there was no urgency to find her. They just kept questioning Aaron. And I understand they have to chase all leads, and I understand that it's suspicious and that Denise could have been involved, but why don't you look for her at the same time? If what they're saying is true, her life is literally in danger, so you can't just focus on one area. Speaking of which, I said before, Denise's lawyer used 2 different phrases, the phrase confirmation bias and tunnel vision. So if I'm being pedantic, apologies, what was going on with the police is tunnel vision, but it's not quite confirmation bias. So I'll quickly explain the difference between the two so that all of you can start thinking like a forensic psychiatrist. So confirmation bias applies to interpreting information through the lens of an existing belief, where tunnel vision is more restricting on the information that you see in the first place. So just to say that again, confirmation bias is twisting information to fit your beliefs, whereas tunnel vision is ignoring information that doesn't fit your beliefs. Confirmation bias is usually involves some level of conscious awareness. So you kind of know that you're doing it, whereas tunnel vision, you literally can't see anything outside, so you don't know that you're doing it. It's like a mental shortcut. So here's an analogy to kind of illustrate the difference. If your brain was Instagram, confirmation bias would be consciously and purposefully posting all of your Instagram pictures with a filter that makes you look sort of more muscly, higher cheekbones, and wearing makeup. Whereas tunnel vision would be subconsciously only taking photos from your left side, from your good side, so they can't see the ugly wart on your face and your lazy eye. So tunnel vision in policing is where investigators fixate on one single suspect or theory, or to the exclusion of other possibilities. So as promised, let's break down some of the key factors in play. So number one reason that you might have tunnel vision if you're a police officer is confirmation bias. I've already just told you what that is. Specifically, availability heuristic. Availability heuristic. So that is bias that leads us to judge the likelihood of something based on how easily we can recall relevant examples. So if a police officer has previously arrested 500 geese, and it sees an animal with a beak and feathers that says, "Bok, bok, 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 I'm a chicken," and the police officer says, "No, I've seen your type before, you're a goose." So if the police have dealt with similar cases involving specific suspects or involving the same MO, modus operandi, they might automatically focus on that as a possibility, even if this current case has some other different details. So to say that again, it's called availability heuristics, not to be confused with anal hirsutism, which is just having a hairy bum, not relevant. Number two reason why you might have tunnel vision with policing is anchoring bias. So this refers to the tendency to fixate on your initial piece of information. So for example, early evidence, early witness statements, and you give it undue weight in your decision making. So basically you have an idea right from the beginning because the first piece of evidence, and you ignore new information that emerges. So in this case, Aaron's story is so bizarre that he has to be lying and nothing else matters. Number three reason why you might have tunnel vision in police investigations, why you might not look at all different leads, is motivational factors. So there might be a desire for closure from the police. There might be a pressure to solve this case quickly and efficiency, and that can lead investigators to prematurely tunnel in on one suspect, and they overlook the need of a more thorough and impartial investigation. Number four reason why you might have tunnel vision in a police investigation is groupthink. So this is group dynamics within police departments. So you can create a pressure to conform to the prevailing theory within the department or to the prevailing suspect, even if one individual officer has doubts. And this can discourage questioning the dominant narrative and exploring alternative possibilities. Number five reason why you might have tunnel vision in a police investigation is organizational factors. So there might be an incentives, there might be a reward system based on arrests or solved cases. So inadvertently, you can incentivize tunnel vision, focusing on the favored suspect for quicker results rather than the correct suspect for the correct results. Okay, moving on, there are more psychological processes that we can see from the police in this documentary, American Nightmares, such as... Before that, I'm just going to quickly introduce you to this channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. Go check out my other videos. It's a smorgasbord of topics related to mental illness and offending and the crossover between the two. I do things that are trending to do with celebrities like Dr. Dre, Jada Pinkett Smith. Sometimes I do on broad topics like why you should have children and the costs. I implore you to subscribe. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it also guarantees that your Deliveroo driver will be quicker from now on. You won't be waiting an hour and a half to get your triple Big Mac and McFlurry. Okay, so next psychological processes, I've already talked about victim blaming. So Detective Mustard from the Vallejo Police Department talks to Denise's mother. And again, I said this before, he tries to insinuate that some children have been abused like Denise has, try and reenact the thrill. Reenact the thrill, really? A grown man, a professional saying that to a victim's family. I don't know what to say to that. I'm just flabbergasted. I just no. Okay, no. And then when Denise is dropped, it comes back and she appears 400 miles from where she's kidnapped. They call it an elaborate hoax, the police. And I think it's reasonable for the police to suspect her because elements of the story are very unusual. But what do you do when you suspect something? You investigate. I admit that it's presumably harder to investigate Denise's story than Aaron's because there's less physical evidence than there would be at the house with Aaron's story. But you wait, surely the logical thing is to wait to find out more information. Don't have a press conference immediately and basically call her a liar publicly. And I get it, maybe there's a pressure from the press to say something about this case that everyone's interested in, but just say that there's inconsistencies and you're investigating it. Don't go and call her a liar without knowing all the details. So it's like, do you remember that time back in 1996 when your father got really angry because somebody left this big log in the toilet that wouldn't flush? He didn't run out and tell all the neighbours that it was your sister. No. He asked you and all your siblings about your bowel habits first, made a decision, and then ran out and told the neighbours that it was your sister. Before I go on talking about the other issues, I want to just revisit the escalating behaviour. So I talked about Wayne Couzens. I said before that some students followed Muller and realised that he lived on Mare Island. And basically they told the police his identity. He was ex-military, he's a lawyer. They delivered the case to police on a silver platypus. But the police dropped the case. Now, I don't think that was tunnel vision. I don't know why they dropped the case. I think it was sheer incompetency. And then we find out at the end of the documentary, just to add some pepper in the wounds of the victims, that there was an affidavit during the investigation into the police's behaviour. And there was even more huge mistakes made by the police officers. They told Aaron that he'd failed the lie detector test. The FBI agent basically did this to force a confession from him. And we learned later that that's actually BS. It was inconclusive, like most lie detector tests are. Denise said that she was SA'd, she was medically examined, and she was not physically damaged, implying that it wasn't actual SA. Again, victim blaming. And there's reasons behind why she wasn't sort of damaged, because he used sort of emotional threats rather than physical force. This is a huge one that I'm about to tell you. Police actually had Aaron's phone in their custody and they put it on airplane mode for 24 hours, even though he told them that the kidnappers said that they were going to call him. So in that time, they'd missed 2 traceable calls when Denise was being held. So let's think about that. So that means that had they just literally kept the phone on, they could have traced where the calls were being made whilst Denise was kidnapped. She could have been rescued. The SA could have been prevented. I mean, that just beggars belief. And then we find out that none of the officers were disciplined. Colonel Mustard got the Police Officer of the Year award from his department in 2015, which begs the question, what exactly do you have to do to get the worst police officer award in Vallejo Police Department? I don't know, maybe you have to assist the bank robbers in carrying out an armed robbery, then you have to drive the getaway car, then you have to go back and give them all a head massage. I really do not know. Okay, I'm about to finish this episode. A quick question for you, my Psych for Sore guys and gals. Just for a bit of balance, I know the police officers don't shroud themselves in glory in this case and many other cases. Can you tell me of any cases where you've had an experience or you know of an experience where the police have actually done very well, carried out their duties very well? Let me know in the Schwab introduction below. I'm genuinely interested to hear your thoughts and experiences. Okay, 2 final thoughts before we finish. If it had not been for Misty Cruz piecing together the puzzle and calling the FBI, Aaron and Denise could have been blamed for a hoax. They could actually be in prison. So they're victims. They could have actually been imprisoned after going through everything they did. And Matthew Muller could be out, continuing his string of kidnappings and SAs. And my final thought is this, is a bit about tunnel vision, right? I was trying to think when I was making this video, how is that related to me and my line of work? I'm a psychiatrist, as you know. When I'm making a psychiatric diagnosis, when I'm carrying out assessments, even if I'm convinced at the beginning what I think the diagnosis is, and sometimes that happens, I need to rule everything out. It's got a name. It's called a differential diagnosis. So for example, if I'm assessing somebody and I think they're in a manic phase of bipolar affective disorder, I also know that it's potentially could be borderline personality disorder because there's such a big overlap, such as mood instability, impulsivity. So what do? I ask those follow-up questions. I ask things that are more likely to indicate borderline personality disorder rather than bipolar, even if I think that it's bipolar. Like I'll ask about deliberate self-harm, drug use, unstable relationships, and arguments. So the point I'm trying to make is I don't use my biases to decide what it is before I know. I am thorough and I'm accurate, and I think that's what the police have to do in every single investigation. Anyway, I've blabbered on enough. I am the ominous Shahominous. I've been great. You've been mediocre. I just want to let you know that I'm going to make another video specifically looking at some of the interrogation techniques that the police used and lifting footage from the documentary American Nightmare. So go chickadee, 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 check it out. Watch the rest of my videos. Subscribe. Have a blessed day, and do not forget, I love you.